Half of every warrior who ever died on a Norse battlefield went to Odin. The other half went somewhere else. That somewhere else was a meadow called Fólkvangr, and it belonged to a goddess. Not Odin's wife, not a daughter of the warrior gods. A goddess from a different tribe entirely, brought to Asgard as a hostage after a war, and given, by the time the old poets were finished telling her story, the right to choose first. Before Odin, every day, the bravest of the slain, the most beautiful of the slain. Whichever of them she wanted, she took, and they walked the long road to her hall, and they ate at her table, and that was the afterlife she ruled. Not as a junior partner in the world of the gods, as a peer. Her name was Freya, which in Old Norse means simply the lady, and the strangest thing about her, the contradiction the Norse never tried to explain, because to them it was not a contradiction at all, is that she was also the goddess of love. Love and war, beauty and battle, gold tears and severed heads. The same hands that blessed marriages collected the dead. We've inherited a habit of putting these things in different rooms. The Norse did not. They built one goddess to hold both, and they called her the most glorious of all. Tonight you'll hear her story the way the original sources tell it, not the cleaned-up version where she's reduced to a Nordic Aphrodite, and not the demonized version where Christian priests turned her into a whore. The version the people who actually worshipped her knew, with the contradictions intact, with the sources cited, with the parts that don't quite fit left exactly where the texts left them. Settle in, the fire is low, the world is quiet. And somewhere, in a hall called seiðr, the seats are filling up. You don't have to remember any of this. You don't have to track the names. The story will hold itself, and so will you. If you've ever fallen asleep to one of these and woken hours later wondering how you got to the end without noticing, that's the point. The voice keeps going. The story keeps moving. Your only job is to listen until you don't, and then to keep not listening, peacefully, until morning. So we begin in the place all Norse stories begin. Not in the modern picture of Vikings with horned helmets and longships, which was mostly invented by 19th century opera, but in the actual world of the people who told these stories. A world of dark winters and short summers, and a sky that, for several months a year, almost never went fully bright. A world where the dead were buried in the shapes of ships and the gods were not always kind. A world where one of the most worshipped figures in the entire pantheon was a goddess whose name we still don't fully understand. The first thing to know about Freya is that her name is not really a name. It's a title. Freya in Old Norse means lady, the feminine form of Freya, which means lord. Her brother, the god of fertility and sunshine and the sacred boar Gullinbursti, was simply called the Lord. She was simply called the Lady. The way the Norse kept these two as the most exalted of an entire tribe of gods, and didn't bother giving either of them a personal name beyond their station, tells you something important. These were not minor figures. These were the figures so central that to say the lady was enough. Everyone knew who you meant. She came from the Vanir, and the Vanir need a moment of explanation because they are easy to misunderstand. Most people who know any Norse mythology know about the seiðr, Odin, Thor, Tyr, Heimdall, the warrior gods of Asgard. The Vanir are the other tribe, older in some accounts, quieter, associated with fertility, with the sea, with magic, with the rhythm of the seasons rather than the clash of weapons. Where the seiðr built halls and threw spears, the Vanir worked in subtler ways. They saw the future. They influenced it. They knew the secret name of every plant and the proper offering for every season. If the Aesir were the loud ones, the Vanir were the ones whose absence you noticed when the harvest failed. Freya's father was Njordr, the Vanir god of the sea, of safe voyages, of harbors, and the prosperity that comes through trade. Her mother is unnamed in the surviving texts, though the Ynglinga saga records in a single startling line that Njordr's wife was his own sister, because Vanir law allowed sibling marriage, and the Vanir, the saga says without flinching, had their own customs. Whoever this unnamed mother was, she vanished from the record before any of the Eddic poems were written down. Some scholars, including the Swedish historian of religions Britt-Marie Näsström, have suggested she may be a half-remembered echo of Nerthus, an earth goddess described by the Roman historian Tacitus around the year 98, whose ritual involved a covered chariot drawn through the fields and a great hush across the land while the goddess passed. The connection is reasonable but unprovable. The texts are silent. Freya had a twin brother, Freya, and the bond between them in the stories is something the surviving sources hint at without ever quite stating outright. They were the chief deities of their tribe. They moved together through the cosmology, like one being split in two. He brought the rain that grew the grain. She brought the love that grew the family. He blessed the field. She blessed the hearth. And in some of the older readings, before the Aesir-Vanir war ended and the laws of Asgard were imposed on the foreigners now living there, the two of them were married, to each other, in the way Vanir gods often were. This is the detail that tends to make modern listeners flinch, and it's worth pausing on. Loki, in the poem Lokasenna, accuses Freya of having slept with her own brother, and her father, standing nearby, doesn't deny it. He just calls Loki a pervert for raising the topic, which is not, strictly speaking, a denial. The implication, if you read the surviving sources without trying to clean them up, is that Vanir custom was simply different. Sibling marriage among the highest gods was a way of keeping divine power within the divine line. The Aesir found it scandalous. The Vanir apparently did not. Remember that detail. We'll come back to it when we talk about the war. The Norse believed that there had once been a time when the two tribes of gods, the Aesir of Asgard and the Vanir of Vanaheim, fought each other. Not a brief skirmish. A long, exhausting war that ended with both sides too tired to win, and a peace agreement that involved a hostage exchange. Freya, her brother Freya, and her father Njordr were sent to live among the Aesir. The Aesir sent Mimir and Heinir back the other way, and Mimir, in one of the more colorful diplomatic incidents in mythology, ended up beheaded. But that's a story for a different night. The cause of the war is recorded in the Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, the most important of all the Eddic poems, and the one that scholars believe preserves the oldest material. The cause was a woman called Gullveig. Gullveig means gold greed or gold drink, depending on who's translating, and she came to Asgard practicing seiðr, a kind of magic we'll come back to, and the Aesir hated what she did to them. She showed them their own desires. She made them want things they hadn't known they wanted. In their fury, they pierced her with spears, and they threw her into the fire of Odin's hall, and she burned. And she rose from the ashes. And they killed her again. And she rose again. 3 times, the Völuspá says. 3 times pierced. 3 times burned. 3 times reborn. Whoever Gullveig was, she could not be killed. Here is what most retellings leave out. Several scholars, most notably Näsström, and earlier the Swedish scholar Fólkvangr, have argued that Gullveig was Freya, not a separate Vanir witch. Freya herself, traveling under another name, the way she so often did. The reasoning is circumstantial but striking. Gullveig is a master of seiðr. So is Freya. Gullveig is associated with gold to the point of obsession. So is Freya, whose tears, the texts say, are red gold. Gullveig cannot be killed. Freya, alone among the major gods, has no recorded fate at Ragnarok. When nearly all the others die, the surviving sources fall silent about hers. She simply continues, like someone who has already been killed and risen from the fire, and so cannot be killed again. This is speculation. The texts never make the identification explicit, but it has the kind of internal logic that makes scholars nod slowly and turn the page back to check the original wording one more time. If Gullveig was Freya, then the war between the gods began with the torture of the goddess of love, which is, when you sit with it, an unusually dark origin story for the Norse cosmos. The piece that the gods built together was built on top of something the gods had done to her, and never quite finished doing, because she could not be finished. In any case, the war ended. The hostages were exchanged. Freya came to Asgard as part of the peace settlement, and the Aesir, perhaps to their embarrassment, found that they liked her there. The Ynglinga saga records the change in matter-of-fact terms. Odin made Njörður and Freya priests of the sacrifices, and Freya became the priestess. She oversaw the offerings. She kept the calendar. She taught them things they had not known. And this is the line the saga leaves you with, which is more revealing than any of the dramatic bits. The personal name of Freya became the honorific used for noble women across the entire Norse world. Every well-born woman came to be called Fru, lady, after her, and the word survives in modern Scandinavian languages still, the way every queen in Britain was once called my lady, after some original lady whose actual title had become the name of every woman of standing. She did not just live among the Aesir. She set the standard for them. The hostage became the model. And here is where the detail I asked you to remember comes back. The sibling marriage, Freya and Freya in the Vanir way, did not survive the peace settlement. The Aesir found the practice scandalous, and the hostages, however honored they now were, lived under Aesir law. The marriage was annulled in everything but memory, which is one quiet way to read what came next in Freya's life. Her marriage to a god named Odin, a husband who, when she got him, would turn out to be almost never actually there. We will come to him. If you know one story about Freya, it's probably the story of the necklace. And if you've heard the version where she sleeps with 4 dwarves to obtain it, you've heard a version that comes from a single late source, written by Christian priests, with the explicit goal of making her look bad. So before we tell that story, we need to tell where it came from, because the smear is part of the story now, and pretending otherwise would be a kind of dishonesty. The necklace is called Brísingamen. The name is half a mystery. Men in Old Norse means neckring or tork or necklace. Brísinga might mean of the Brísings, suggesting a tribe of dwarves whose name we no longer have. Or it might come from a word meaning fire or amber, in which case the necklace is the fiery one, or the amber-colored one. Both readings are defensible. Most modern scholars accept that we will probably never know for sure. What we do know is that Brísingamen was Freya's most prized possession. She wore it constantly. The Eddic poets and the Skaldic verses refer to her by it again and again. Possessor of Brísingamen. The way Achilles is the man with the spear, Freya is the woman with the necklace. Heimdall is called seeker of Freya's necklace in one source, hinting at a lost myth in which he recovered it from Loki. A fragment of a poem called Husdrapa preserves the recovery, with both Loki and Heimdall fighting in the form of seals somewhere off the coast until the necklace was returned. Beyond that fragment, the recovery story is mostly lost to time. What survived instead was the acquisition story. And this is where things get complicated. The acquisition story comes from the Sörla Thatr, a short narrative tucked into the late 14th century Icelandic manuscript Flatey Jarbok, written by 2 Christian priests named Jon Thordarson and Magnus Thorhalsson, 400 years after the Viking Age had ended. Their goal was not to preserve the myth. Their goal was to discredit it. The story they told goes like this. Freya, who in their version is reduced from a goddess to a kind of Asian queen, euhemerism was the standard medieval tactic for turning pagan gods into mortal kings and witches, wandered past a stone where 4 dwarves were forging a necklace of unbearable beauty. She wanted it. They named their price. The price was that she sleep with each of them in turn, on consecutive nights. She agreed. She paid. She went home with the necklace. Loki somehow found out, and told Odin, and Odin sent Loki to steal it back. And from there the story spirals into a 100-year war and ends, conveniently, with the arrival of a Christian king named Olaf Tryggvason, who breaks the curse simply by being baptized. You can hear, even in summary, what kind of story this is. It is propaganda. It is 2 priests in 14th century Iceland inventing an excuse to call the old goddess of love a whore, and then resolving the chaos she causes by having a Christian arrive and clean it up. The Sturla Thatr is a real source, and it preserves real fragments of older material. The 4 dwarven names, Alfric, Berling, Dvalin, and Greir, are likely genuine, but the moral framing belongs entirely to the priests. The Norse, when they actually worshipped Freya, did not consider her promiscuous. They considered her generous, powerful, and free. Those are not the same thing. Strip the smear away, and what you have, in the older sources, is a goddess who possessed an extraordinary necklace whose origins are deliberately mysterious. A piece of jewelry that may have been gold, may have been amber, may have been both, worn by the most beautiful goddess in the cosmos. Stolen, at one point, by Loki, who was caught and beaten by Heimdall in the form of a seal. Recovered. Returned. Worn again. The medieval Christian reading is the version most people have inherited. The older reading is quieter and more dignified. Both are worth knowing. Only one is fair. She had other treasures. The most famous, after the necklace, was a cloak made of falcon feathers. Fjardramr in Old Norse, which translates as something like feather skin or feather shape. Whoever wore it could fly. If the wearer was a god, they could take the form of a falcon. If the wearer was someone less, they simply flew, lifted into the sky as if the cloak were doing all the work for them. Here is something curious that the texts make clear if you read them carefully. The surviving sources almost never show Freya using the cloak herself. They show her lending it. To Loki, twice. The first time, when the goddess Idun was kidnapped by the giant Thjazi, Loki begged Freya for the cloak so that he could fly to Jotunheim and bring Idun home. Freya gave it to him. The second time, in the poem Thrymskvida, the Lay of Thrymr, Thor's hammer Mjolnir had been stolen by a giant, and Loki needed to fly to the giant's hall to negotiate its return. He went to Freya. He asked for the cloak again. Thrymr, the giant, made his terms. He would return the hammer in exchange for Freyja as his bride. Loki flew home with the news. Thor, helpfully, suggested they simply hand Freya over. And Freya's response in the poem is one of the few moments in the Eddic poetry where the goddess of love speaks for herself. And what she does, the text tells us, is rage so violently that the halls of every god in Asgard tremble, and the necklace Brísingamen breaks off her neck and falls. She refuses. Absolutely. Without negotiation. This is the moment the gods realize they will need a different plan. The plan they come up with, and it is, by any measure, one of the most genuinely funny passages in the entire body of Norse literature, is to dress Thor in Freya's clothes, put the bridal veil over his enormous beard, and send him to the giant's hall pretending to be Freya. He goes. Loki, also dressed as a maid, accompanies him. Thrymr is delighted with his new bride, who eats an entire ox and drinks 3 barrels of mead and stares at him through the veil with eyes that, Loki improvises smoothly, have not slept in 8 nights from longing for you, my lord. The hammer is brought out. Thor seizes it. Everybody dies. The whole episode is a comic set piece, and it depends entirely on the original premise that Freya, the actual Freya, would never be handed over to a giant against her will. Even in a story whose machinery is mostly cross-dressing and mead, the dignity of the lady has to be preserved. Thor will wear a dress before Freya will become someone else's possession. Mythology sometimes has a way of telling you what its writers actually believed by what they refused to write. Now we come to the part of her story that, more than any other, explains why she mattered. The most powerful god in Norse mythology is Odin. Everyone knows this. He is the All-Father, the king of Asgard, the one-eyed wanderer who sacrificed himself to himself, hanging from the world tree for 9 days to learn the secret of the runes. He knows things mortals cannot know. He commands ravens that bring him news of the world. He has, by the time the surviving sources describe him, every form of magic the Norse knew of. There is one form he had to learn from someone else, and that someone else was Freya. The form is called seiðr. The Ynglinga saga, written by Snorri Sturluson around the year 1225, as the opening of his great history of the kings of Norway, records the moment plainly. Njordr's daughter Freya was the priestess of the sacrifices. Snorri writes, and she first taught the Asaland people the magic art, as it was the custom among the Vanaland people. That is the moment. That is the line. Odin, the All-Father, the master of every magic, learned one of his magics from a Vanir hostage who had come to live in his hall. Seiðr is not easy to translate. It is sometimes called Norse shamanism, which is too neat. It is sometimes called sorcery, which is too dark. It is something stranger and older and harder to pin down. The closest we can come is a kind of magic that involved trance, song, and the manipulation of fate itself. A völva, a seiðr practitioner, would mount a high seat, take herbs, sing the chant called Vardlokur, and enter a state in which she could see what was coming, and sometimes change what was coming. The future was not fixed. The future could be looked at, leaned on, occasionally bent, but only by people who knew how. And Freya knew how. She was the source. This is, by Norse standards, an extraordinary thing to admit about a goddess. The seiðr magic was associated with the Vanir, and within the Vanir tradition it was women's work. When men practiced it, they were considered ergi, a word that meant unmanly in a way that carried both shame and accusation. Loki accuses Odin of practicing seiðr in the Lokasenna, and the accusation lands hard enough that Odin doesn't bother denying it. The All-Father, faced with the choice between knowing the most powerful magic in the cosmos and being thought unmanly for knowing it, had quietly chosen the magic, which is, on reflection, a very Odin decision. He had practiced it, he had learned it from her, and the fact that he, the king of gods, had been willing to learn an art that his own warrior culture considered beneath a man's dignity tells you something about how powerful the art was. He wanted it more than he cared what people thought of him for having it. There is one more thing about her seiðr that the surviving sources hint at without quite spelling out. The practitioners of seiðr were said to have power over fate itself, and in the old understanding, fate and death sat very close to one another. The seeress in Eirik Saga Rauda uses seiðr to learn what is coming, and, in some readings, to bend it. As the source of the art, Freya held that power at its root. The sources do not say outright that she could undo death. They simply assume she could see further into it than anyone else, and they leave the implication where it lies. If you've ever heard a different version of this story, the one where Odin is the supreme magician of Norse mythology, the master of every art and the source of every secret, this is the moment that version starts to fall apart. The supreme magician learned from her. The most clever god in Asgard sat at the feet of the priestess from Vanaheim and asked her to show him how. The texts say so. They say so in a single line that is easy to miss, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. For all her power, the surviving stories give Freya one persistent grief. Her husband disappeared, and she never found him. His name was Odin. Frenzied one, the name means, or passionate, or the inspired. Snorri describes him plainly in the Prose Edda. Freya was married to a man called Odin. Their daughters were Hnoss and Gersemi, names that mean treasure and jewel, and whose beauty, the texts say, was so great that any beautiful or precious thing in the Norse world came afterward to be called by their names. A lovely heirloom was a Hnoss. A precious object was a Gersemi. The daughters became the words, but Odin went away. Snorri does not say where. He does not say why. He says only that Odin left on long journeys, and that while he was gone, Freya stayed in their hall, and she wept. Her tears, the texts insist, were red gold. Drop after drop. They fell on the floors of Seiðr, and they hardened where they fell, and the dwarves and the skalds knew this, and so in the kennings of Norse poetry, those compressed metaphors that the skalds used in place of plain words, gold itself came to be called Freyja's tears, or Odin's bedmate's eye rain, or the rain from Freyja's eyes. To say gold in the old skaldic verse, you said what Freyja wept. She could not bear it. After a while she would set out. She would leave her hall and travel through worlds she did not know, looking for him, and because she did not want strangers to recognize the goddess of love walking among them, she gave herself other names as she went. The Prose Edda lists them. Meadow, which means brightness of the sea. Hörn, which may mean flax, an old plant of women's work. Gefn, which means the giver. Seiðr, which means sow, a name connected to her sacred boar. Vanadis, which means lady of the Vanir. Each name a disguise, each name a piece of who she still was, even when she did not want to be recognized. The strangest of them, the one that pulls you up short, is meadow, brightness of the sea. Why would a fertility goddess from the inland fields take a name that means the gleam on water? Some scholars think it refers to the lost sea myth in which Heimdall recovered her necklace from Loki off some unnamed coast. Some think it preserves a memory, much older than the texts, of a goddess associated with ships. And we are coming back to that thread, I promise you, because it leads somewhere. What we are told, plainly and beautifully, is that she never gave up. She wandered. She wept gold. She named herself and renamed herself and named herself again. And the husband whose name meant the inspired was always somewhere ahead of her, just out of reach, and the world did not record what became of him. He simply does not return in the surviving stories. The marriage ends in absence, not in death, which is, perhaps, a worse ending. Death has finality. Absence has none. If you've ever lost someone whose absence kept happening, someone who was simply gone, with no clear reason, no clear ending, this is the goddess your ancestors prayed to. She knew. She had been doing it longer than any of them. We come now to the field that gives this episode its title. Fólkvangr. The name means field of the people, or field of the host, or field of the army, depending on which translator you trust. It is a meadow. Within it stands her hall, called seiðr, which means seat-roomy, or many-seated, or the hall of many seats. And it is to that meadow and that hall that half of every Norse warrior who ever fell in battle was taken when they died. The other half went to Odin's Valhalla. We've all heard of Valhalla. Most of us have never heard of Fólkvangr, and that is not an accident. The Christian conversion preferred to remember the warrior hall of the King of Gods. It quietly forgot the women's field next door. Here is the line from the Grimnismal, the Lay of Grimnir, one of the older poems in the Poetic Edda, where Odin himself, disguised, is speaking. The ninth is Fólkvangr, where Freya decrees who shall have seats in the hall. Half of the slain she chooses each day, and Odin has the other half. Read that carefully. Slow down. Read it twice if you need to. She chooses. Not Odin chooses, and the leftovers go to Freya. Not the gods together choose, and Freya gets her share. She chooses. Half of the slain she selects. Odin gets the other half, the implication being the half she did not want. This is the detail that the popular versions almost always smooth over, and it is the most theologically important fact about her in the entire Norse tradition. The goddess from the conquered tribe, brought as a hostage, became the first chooser of the dead. She had priority. The All-Father, the King of Gods, the one to whom every warrior dreamed of being chosen. He came second. The lady went first. This is the moment I was pointing toward at the very beginning. The contradiction at the heart of her myth, goddess of love, collector of warriors, is not a contradiction once you understand the order of selection. It is a single coherent power. The same eye that knows what is beautiful knows what is brave. The same hand that blesses a marriage gathers a body. To the Norse, these were not separate competencies. They were the same competency, applied to different occasions. Why then does Valhalla get all the attention? Partly because Odin is the loudest figure in the surviving texts, and his hall is described in detail while seiðr is barely sketched. Partly because the medieval Christian compilers preferred a heroic warrior afterlife to a goddess's quiet meadow. And partly, this is the thing that takes a moment to sit with, because we have inherited a habit of thinking of female power as decorative. The Norse did not share that habit. They put their highest goddess in charge of the dead, gave her first pick, and assumed without comment that this made sense. And here is where the thread about ships, the one I promised would lead somewhere, finally lands. The name seiðr, the seat-roomy hall, appears not only in mythological sources but in a 2012 paper by Joseph Hopkins and Haukur Thorgeirsson, also as a possible ship name. A great ship, with many seats. And here is the connection. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have found stone ships, formations of standing stones in the shape of ship hulls, built into burial mounds. Hundreds of them, sometimes ordinary, sometimes vast. And the Norse buried their dead inside them. Ship-shaped graves, in the middle of fields, a ship in a meadow. Hopkins and Thorgeirsson argue carefully that seiðr may have been imagined as exactly this, a great ship sitting in the field of Fólkvangr with many seats, where the chosen dead sat and ate and were carried, slowly, mythologically, across whatever sea separates the living from the rest. Which, if true, means that every stone ship in every burial mound in every coastal field of Scandinavia was a small, hand-built echo of seiðr. The Norse buried their dead in the shape of her hall. This is the kind of detail that, when you sit with it, changes the way you hear the whole story. Before this story closes, there is one scholarly question it would be dishonest to skip. Scholars have argued for over a century that Freya and Frigg, Odin's wife, the queen of Asgard, may once have been the same goddess, the same figure, split in two as the centuries passed. The case for it is real. Both are linked to prophecy. Both are linked to magic. Both have husbands who wander. Both have necklaces. Both have falcon cloaks in some versions. Frigg's husband is Odin. Freya's is Odr, and the two names come from the same root word, a word meaning frenzy or inspiration. Both wives mourn. Both wait. The case against it is also real. The linguists, when asked, side with the case against. The names Frigg and Freya come from different roots with different meanings, and in the surviving texts, when the two appear together at gatherings, they are clearly two separate beings sitting at different parts of the hall. The truth, as is often the case in mythology, is probably somewhere in between. There may have been an older Germanic goddess, predating the split, from whom both descended as the tribes spread and the language drifted. Frigg preserves one half of her. Freya preserves another. By the time anyone wrote any of this down, they had been separate for centuries. They remembered being related. They were not the same. There is something I want you to understand before we let this story close, and it is the thing that has been quietly moving underneath everything we have said tonight. The goddess of love and the chooser of the slain are the same goddess. That is not a contradiction. It is a description of how the Norse understood power. The kind of power that mattered most to them was not the kind that performed itself. Odin's power performs itself constantly. He wanders, he speaks in riddles, he hangs from trees, he calls attention to himself. Thor's power performs itself even more. He kicks down doors, he carries a hammer that announces him before he arrives. These are loud powers. Freya's power is quiet. She sits in a hall most listeners have never heard of. She chooses, and the dead come, and they take their seats, and the seats are roomy enough for everyone, and the hall is in a meadow, and the meadow is, in the deepest readings, a ship, sailing slowly nowhere, holding more than it should be able to hold. There is no announcement. There is no spectacle. There is the goddess and the chosen and the long silence of the field. If you've ever known someone whose strength was like this, strength that did not need to perform itself, that did not require an audience, that simply was and held what needed holding, you've already met her, in some form. Every culture has had to find a name for that kind of power. The Norse called her the Lady. They gave her first pick of the dead. They built her a hall whose name meant room enough for everyone. Next time, if you'd like to come back, we'll spend the night with the other queen of Asgard. Frigg, the wife of Odin, the only god who knows the future and refuses to say what she sees. The one Freya has been confused with for 1,000 years. The one who weeps for her son and never bends. Her story, like Freya's, is older than the texts that preserve it, and quieter than the warrior gods around her. There is more there than the medieval compilers wanted us to know. But that is for another night. For now, half of every warrior who ever died went to Odin. The other half went somewhere else, somewhere quieter. To a meadow, and a ship, and a hall with room for everyone. She chose. She still chooses. The lady of the Vanir, the priestess of sacrifices, the keeper of seiðr, the wife who wept gold for a husband who would not return. The first chooser, the most glorious of all the goddesses, Freya. Rest now. You don't have to remember any of it. The best of it will still be there in the morning. If this story found you at the right moment, if it gave you something to carry or something to set down, consider subscribing to Sleepable Mythology. There are more of these waiting. More gods. More goddesses. More halls quieter than the loud ones. More powers older than the obvious ones. More stories the warrior cultures forgot to write down. Sleep well. The seats are filling. The field is wide. There is room for you, too. Good night.